by DA Parliamentary Leader Lindiwe Mazibuko. Lindiwe, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Why are you so desperate to stop this deployment?
Well, at the moment we're operating in the middle of an information blackout. We haven't received any further information since the initial briefing about the death of 13 soldiers in the Central African Republic. And increasingly it looks as though Parliament may have been misled when the President first notified the Defence Committee that he would be deploying troops to the Central African Republic. It's not clear on what international agreement or other obligation basis the troops were deployed. It's not clear whether or not a second memorandum of understanding actually exists, which authorized the President to send troops into the CAR. And increasingly, the reason that was given to Parliament, which was that the troops would be there to engage in capacity building and some possible protection of the President of the Central African Republic, are now being disputed, particularly because of the fact that the 13 soldiers who died in active combat. Now, that has nothing to do with capacity building the troops there or with VIP protection. So there are many more questions than answers. But most importantly, we need to withdraw our troops because our presence there is no longer tenable, given the political situation in the Central African Republic. Parliament has the power to withdraw these troops. We have access to a motion, a constitutional motion that enables us to have them withdrawn immediately, pending a full investigation, and that needs to happen as soon as possible.
Parliament obviously in recess at the moment, but you're asking for Max Sisulu to please convene. When are you hoping that would happen?
I would like for the Speaker of the National Assembly to convene Parliament this week, as soon as possible. It is not an unusual move. It has happened in the past for much less important reasons. In the past, we have reconvened Parliament, for example, because a law needed to be passed because there was no quorum in a previous sitting. Very spurious reasons have been forwarded, usually at the request of the government. But Parliament as an institution has to take responsibility for the fact that as Commander-in-Chief, the President accounts to Parliament, and not only to the Defence Committee, but to the International Relations Committee and many others who would have an interest in this deployment. And the power is in the Speaker's hands to convene Parliament as soon as possible so that we as an institution can secure this withdrawal, even as the government seems not even to be giving us information about when or how it'll happen.
You did mention the reasons that you were given and Parliament was given for the deployment. And then, of course, you were here to listen to the Mail and Guardian's comments. What are you making of all of that?
Well, that's one of the reasons this information blackout has to stop. And we've not only called for the sitting of Parliament to be brought back so that we can table this motion to withdraw the troops. We've also called We've also called for a joint ad hoc committee to investigate, a full parliamentary inquiry to investigate why this deployment took place. Because we are now hearing conflicting reports about how the Minister of Defence, Lindiwe Mazibuko, was opposed to the deployment. We're hearing that the Department of International Relations was not given, did not give a mandate, a political mandate for the deployment to take place, and that National Treasury is unhappy with the fact that over R1 billion over 5 years was earmarked for the purpose of this deployment. And if it turns out that this deployment took place in order to protect economic interests for a political party, it is a scandal on a scale that is unheard of in our country, in our democracy thus far. And the President and his entire government have to be accountable for it. So Parliament has the power of subpoena. By law, we are allowed to subpoena members of the public, members of the executive, to a formal inquiry to come and testify. And Parliament needs to exercise that right on behalf of the South African people and not simply be an institution that protects the government, but one which holds the government accountable. And given that President Zuma is the Commander-in-Chief, it's just unthinkable that the Commander-in-Chief of our armed forces would deploy them in order to protect political interests, dictatorships, or economic interests for those who are politically connected to the ANC. It is unthinkable, but the allegation is out there. It now needs to be dealt with in a proper forum, and Parliament has the power to actually institute that.
As you mentioned, details are a bit fuzzy. To your knowledge, how many of our troops are out there?
Well, the President's request at the beginning of this year was for the deployment of 500 troops. We know that we have lost 13, and we have heard from reports that there are somewhere above 20, possibly more troops who are still in the Central African Republic. There are conflicting reports about whether some troops have been withdrawn, whether some are still at the airport. Again, information blackout, which has to come to an end, because we cannot simply fold our hands and hope that the government, given how cagey it has been thus far, is suddenly going to volunteer this information. We have to take responsibility and summon the government government to the National Assembly to come and account for this. So our information is as sketchy as everybody else's. We learn from news reports from troops who have come back, what has happened on the ground. And the only people who can explain to us what happened, when, how, on what basis, and why Parliament was only given limited information, which seems to be the case, are the President, the Defence Minister, and the Minister of International Relations. And we want them to come to Parliament to account for this.
Lindiwe, I have to ask you the question. This is an isolated incident in that country, but we have troops all the way through Africa. Are those deployments now going to be in question as well?
I think every deployment has to be subject to scrutiny under the Constitution and the law. And in the DA, we've always been very vigilant about when we are notified as members of Parliament about deployments, about scrutinising the reasons and approving them accordingly. So we have absolutely no problem. In fact, it's a major part of our foreign policy that South Africa should play an active part in UN peacekeeping missions, African Union peacekeeping missions, and certainly that we must uphold any memoranda of understanding that exist between us and other states on the continent. It's an important role that we have to play as Africa's major economic power and as a member of BRICS. All of that is important. But our troops cannot be sent into political situations to become a militia for an illegitimate government or in order to prop up a regime or prop up the economic interests of people who are not protecting the national interest. We can only ever deploy our troops in terms of proper international obligations that have been properly ratified. And when Parliament was informed of this deployment in January, that is what we thought was happening until we learned about the 13 deaths. Now, as I said, 13 deaths could only come from an active combat situation rather than a training program. And so it becomes suspicious and more questions are asked about why our troops were actually deployed there, contrary to the reasons that Parliament was given. So we'll always support the South African Defence Force having an active presence on the continent where it has been legitimately gazetted, where we have memoranda of understandings and where there are UN and AU obligations for us to fulfill. What we can't sanction and we won't sanction is any deployment that has not got the national interest at its heart and which, even worse, could have the personal interests of politically connected people.
Lindiwe, before you go, is the DA standing alone in Parliament on this? Do you have any other supporters? I'm
going to be canvassing the other opposition parties. As you know, we have a multi-party opposition forum in the National Assembly on which we engage on major issues, and I'm going to be writing to the leaders of all those parties to engage them on this matter and to canvass their support for the ad hoc committee to conduct a full inquiry and for Parliament coming back from recess in order to consider this matter. But in the DA, we're very clear about the division between party and state. This isn't a party political matter. It's a matter of state security and national interest. And in that regard, it's not an issue so much of the ANC, but of the government using its position potentially to prop up ANC-connected people and to prop up the ANC's investment arm, Chancellor House. So we must use our constitutional resources at our disposal to find out the truth about this deployment. But where possible, we will try to secure the support of other parties in Parliament. Absolutely.